All right, let me get this going. All right, so if I'm too loud, just let me know. I tend to talk pretty loud when I do presentations. I get pretty amped up about this stuff. Or I'm talking too fast, just kind of do a slow down thing. So I got to start with a little confession. Yesterday I had a to-do to add slides about why I should be the CEO of Yahoo. But instead of making the slides, I took my son to Maker Faire. Who here went to Maker Faire yesterday? Yeah, it was pretty awesome. So instead of those slides, I have blurry slides from my camera of robots. Sorry about that, kind of things with Yahoo stuff. So, no disrespect to Mr. Crawford. Make fun of who we like. So, the future is here. The scope of the way that people consume content on the web is drastically changing. This is a picture of Liza Gardner making content love to all the different devices she uses to get content from the web, right? But even this picture is kind of a lie, since most of the devices in here are Apple devices. People access your content through a whole multitude of devices, right? This is nothing new. Fun fact, 46% of all Americans own smartphones. And about half of them are using it to access apps, and half of them are using them to access web content with their phones. So it's about on par. By the year 2015, mobile traffic is going to overcome desktop traffic. And it's probably going to happen even sooner than that. This is like a thing that's happening. So almost half of all traffic in Asia and Africa is mobile traffic. In a lot of parts of Africa, more people access their banks through their smartphone than they do through an actual bank, which is kind of a crazy concept, right? Something we're kind of just beginning to hear over in those countries where they don't have a lot of banks. Smartphones are the way that they get access to this stuff and this data. So this means new challenges, but actually old challenges. I don't know if you guys remember, when monitors got really big, we all got really excited about fluid layouts, right? We had to use all the real estate in the screen. It turned out that wasn't really a big deal. 960 wide was good enough for everybody else. For mobile devices, it's not the same story, right? If you bring up a regular website on your phone, it doesn't look good at all. It's too small. So this time, we do really have to care. Trust me. Let's just talk about HTC. HTC alone has 8 different screen size resolution combinations, and that's not even counting orientation. And HTC is one of the simplest of all Android lineups. It doesn't include Acer, Motorola, LG, Sony, Ericsson. There's 25 other manufacturers of Android phones. And that's just Android phones, not iPads, iPhones, Kindles, regular Fire Silk, and then I guess WebOS doesn't really hit the shoot anymore. But there's lots of different screen sizes, and you can't design for all of them. Designing a different interface for every single screen size for all these devices is impossible. But not considering the fact that people are accessing your content on these devices is a death sentence. Obviously, if you're building a native app or something and you don't care about content or delivery, it's not an issue. But for most of us, we're building content that gets distributed on the web. And people are viewing it at different screen sizes. If they can't get it at the device that they're on right then, they're probably not going to view your content. So the old ways of web design don't work. As my introduction, hi, I'm Matt. I'm a partner at Zurb. Zurb is an interaction design and strategy company. We've worked with over 200 startups since 1998 and created over $1 billion in exits. We've also worked with a couple large companies you may recognize from this list. So I kind of presented the problem of the fact that we have to have our content easily viewed on mobile devices. So how do we handle this and what are the tools? The main tool I'm going to talk about today is responsive web design. I'm sure you guys have heard this buzzword quite a bit. We're going to dig into it a little bit, and then also how do we use it to do quick prototypes. So what's so great about responsive? You can develop for any device very quickly. The idea behind responsive is that we develop one code base, and that code works on every single screen size. We can cut down significantly on development time because we are just using the single code base for all these different devices. And we're ready for devices that don't exist yet. Again, responsive says our content is just going to flow to whatever the screen size of that page is, and then we'll deal with it. Part of that is also designing for device classes. So there's a little bit of a myth about responsive, which is that you just develop once and don't care about the screen size. That's not totally true. We kind of observe, we view things as falling into 3 different device classes. You got your desktops, your phones, and maybe you consider tablets a third class. Really, there's just two classes, desktops and phones. Even if you're using responsive and you have a fluid layout, you still need to consider how phones react and how desktops react, because it's a totally different experience, right? We have touch versus click, and the screen size is just so dramatic. You may need some separate UI elements as well. But the goal behind responsive is to share the majority of the code and have as little duplication as possible so that we can just keep distributing our applications. And also not caring too much about the small differences in screen sizes. So what we're going to talk about today is rapid responsive prototyping. It's kind of buzzword bingo. I'm going to break that down really quick. I like to think of prototyping kind of like flossing. Whenever I present prototyping to someone, it's something we practice a lot as Zerb. But when I talk about it, it's like one of those things people know they should be doing, but they just don't do it, right? Who here knows what prototyping is? Right? The rest of you, it's too lazy to raise your hands. It's 5 o'clock, I get it. What if I told you if you didn't prototype, or if you didn't floss, your teeth would look like this? Yeah, okay, I'll put a slide. You probably floss like 3 times a day, right? I can't prove that. I'm not a dentist, but I do know that if you're not prototyping, your pages may end up looking like that on mobile. It's the same kind of thing. It's preventative medicine. You can build your entire app and then figure out how do you jam that thing onto a phone. Or you can have your prototypes be tested on mobile early on and figure out how is design going to work on mobile before you invest all your time building this giant thing and then just having it totally suck on the different devices. Preventative medicine. I mean, you can just let your teeth fall out and put in the grill, but I like my teeth right now, so I'm just going to keep them. And great design is all about iteration. These two guys went through tons of iterations for the phone. This famous phone, they revolutionized industrial design, right? It's all about iteration. From Steve Jobs carrying this piece of wood in his pocket to feel what it would like to have the iPhone in his pocket, to all the different iterations that we saw, one every year, right? You gotta buy the latest one, to the current iteration that you probably all have in your pocket right now. From an okay juicer, to a better juicer, to a really good juicer, it's all about iteration. Tons and tons of iterations. You can't just wake up and have the light bulb go off and go, yeah, I have a perfect answer what this product's supposed to be. You have to get there incrementally. And the faster you can get there, that's the competitive edge you're gonna have over your competitors. So, the Death Star, right? This is a great example in failed rapid prototyping. First iteration didn't do so well. Second one did better, took a whole fleet, it still got blown up. But obviously they didn't do enough prototyping and they spent a lot of time on those iterations. It took years to build a second Death Star. A little bit of prototyping might have cut that off, right? I don't know what Darth Vader was doing, but he certainly wasn't prototyping. So, rapid, responsive prototyping. We're prototyping so we can get to answers faster, we're doing it quickly, and we're doing it across multiple devices so we know what this is going to look like when we actually build it. And you don't have to be a UX professional to do this. In fact, I think it's better if you're not. The best people that I've met that can do design are people who are T-shaped people. They have some design skills, and they have a really deep technical knowledge of the medium they're designing for, right? How can you talk about designing for the web if you don't know how the web pages get assembled and coded? I'm not saying you need to be like a Rails backend database engineer to write front-end code, but you do need to have a pretty good understanding of how a web page is laid out, how does CSS work, how does browser support work, to be able to kind of design these pieces. So, as all of our designers, anything that you design in Photoshop, you personally have to code out. That's their responsibility. And it very quickly trains people to only build things that are going to work on the devices, so we get a much higher quality output from that. So here's my first random your first slide. So lawn gnomes with like grenade launchers and machine guns. All right, so that was a lot of talk. I do want to get this in technical a bit, so I'm not just going to talk about rapid prototyping. I'm actually going to walk you through a couple examples of rapid prototyping that we've done. And I also want to talk about the tools that you're going to want to have in your toolbox when you're doing this rapid prototyping for multiple devices. So the most important piece of that is having a grid system. A fluid, powerful grid system that's going to be very flexible and let you do your layouts and have them work across multiple devices. You can then tweak them later. It needs to let you have a single code base, looks good on desktop, and tablets, and also phones. It should work something like this. It should have columns. I like a dozen columns, some people are into 16, whatever floats your boat. Fluid percentage-based with an arbitrary max width. So what that means is we're going to put a max width on our grid. So for very large screens, it doesn't get beyond that. It's fairly difficult to design for a very, very large screen. It's not as hard to design for a smaller screen like a phone. So So we're still going to set that max width. If you want to, it's very easy to just turn that off. A single line of CSS, and don't make this wider than this, right? But everything else is going to be totally fluid. So we're going to use all the reels that we have on all the different devices. Modify by queries for small devices. So we do have some breakpoints in here. I was talking about different classes of devices. We need to be able to target the phone specifically to show or hide certain elements. And we need to be able to change our grid when we're on the phone because the standard layout is just not going to work there. But I'll get to that in a minute. So I want to walk you through an example of how we would use a grid to rapidly prototype. A fluid, responsive, flexible grid. This is a website called Rebecca Children's Services. Every year at ZERB, we do a thing called ZERB Wired, where we take applications from nonprofits, we select one of the nonprofits, and then we work 24 hours, 8 a.m. to 8 a.m., to build a total new website for them. We do mood boards, visual design, copy, and then at the end of that period, we actually launch the new website, right? So it's a big exercise in time boxing, and every year, we have to launch it by 8 o'clock. That's the rule. Whatever is done, it gets launched. So the way that we do that is we start with sketching. This is a more low fidelity way of prototyping. I won't talk too much about sketches, except that you should be doing it. We did about 200 sketches with 3 designers over, I think, about 6 hours. So they sat down with the people from the nonprofit and we just banged out all these sketches to kind of get the layout for all the pages, make sure we had all the pages, and we were able to quickly kind of sell our ideas to them. This should look like this, what do you think? No good, throw it in the garbage, maybe recycle it. If it's good, you keep going. And then from there, we're able to build our static prototype, which is what we're going to be able to test on multiple devices. So taking those and then coding them up in our kind of bare bones framework took about 2 hours. So this is our responsive prototype. It's very bare bones. It's on a lightweight framework that we use, and we're able to build almost all of this with no CSS. The only piece of CSS is for that hero piece right at the top, and that's only a couple lines. The rest of it is all just using the semantic markup that responds to our grid. I'll show you how it's laid out. So we've got a row on the top, 3 columns and 9 columns. The hero piece is a full 12 columns. Each of these little images is 4 columns. And the markup is pretty simple. It's something like this. We have our container with our row and our columns within that row. This is really easily kind of chop up the layout and throw it in the page so we can see what it's going to be like. Your grid you're using should have a container element. It's going to give you a little bit of basic side padding. Just make sure that your text never runs up against the edge of the device that you're looking at. Within a container, we should have a row. The row is just going to have our arbitrary max width so that it never goes beyond what we're designing for on the high end. You can just take this off if you want to use the whole part of the screen. And then within the row, you put your columns. This is how you kind of lay out your text. So here we have 3 columns on the left, 9 columns on the right. And what the grid does is it puts a gutter in between those columns so you have a little bit of spacing. You don't have to worry about how you lay out this stuff. The grid just does this for you. We can add another row below that, and below that one. And to create more advanced layouts, we can also nest rows within that first row. So we can nest another one that maybe has 9 and 3, or 4 and 6. And we can use nested columns to create even more advanced layouts. So here on this left, I have 8 columns. And then I can embed a row in here to do the kind of standard image on the left, title and text on the right. 2 columns for my image, and 10 columns for my content. The classes for the grid should look, something like this. 1, 2, 3 columns. It's nice to have stuff like offset by 4, offset by 2. It will just take those columns and push them over. And also being able to center columns is really good. Another important thing is to make sure the grid you're using is easily customizable. Something you may not think about, but when you actually go into implementation, you're going to see how much of a pain this is. So most grids, you can't customize the gutters, which is, again, that distance between the different columns. The CSS for a grid column probably looks something like this. We're floating it. We have a min height just to make sure that the columns never get fully collapsed. We're going to position it relative. And then that margin left, 4.4%, that's our gutter. Now, the problem with doing a gutter like that is that our columns are defined like this. So one column is going to be, let's see, this is wrong, it's really a column. One column is going to be 4.3%, right? Times 12, that's roughly 100% minus the size for the gutters that go in there. So if you want to modify that gutter, you have to go back and modify the CSS for every one of those columns. right? Which is a huge pain. So if you download somebody's grid system, you're going to try to do that, it's kind of a nightmare. If you want to customize the grid itself, you want to add another column, you want to use 16 set 12, or you want to modify the gutters. What you really want to do is have something like this, where each column has 8.33%, so those all add up to 100%, right? Then you can go back and really easily do the columns, do the gutters. You want to specify your gutters something like padding. So padding is 0 to 15%. It's going to put a little bit of padding in each one of our columns to create our gutters. But then if we modify that, I don't know if that's going to work. So can anybody tell me what's going to happen if all my columns add to 100% and I specify my gutters with padding? What's that? Exactly. It's going to go outside 100%, right? So when we define the width, it's the width of the element, not counting the padding. So if only the padding is part of the width. Does anybody know how you solve this problem?
Box size.
Yeah, box sizing. That thing that everyone hated in IE6 is actually a great way to solve this problem. So box border, you can turn this on. Ironically, in every browser except for IE7, you can turn on the box model. I guess within IE6, they turned it off in IE7 and then decided they needed to bring it back in IE8. If you want it to work properly in all devices, or all browsers, you do need to have the prefix for Mozilla and WebKit so it works properly on the iOS devices. And again, it's not supported in IE7. So what that does is it lets us specify all of our columns as 100% when they all add up, and then we can just put padding for our gutters. So that way it's really easy to customize the gutters on the grid. This is a random image. All right, images in our responsive framework. Images need to just flow to whatever the size of their container is, right? This way on the small devices it'll be small, and the big devices will be big. It's one line of CSS. You just set the width to max width 100%. What that does is it says, let this flow to the size of my container up to the native resolution, and don't get any larger than that. Width 100% will scale your image up. This ensures it never gets scaled up past the native resolution. Images in a responsive design have to be able to scale for different devices, like you mentioned. And they can either be large enough to handle the largest display you're going to support, or you can swap them out with something like ScotGel's responsive images solution. So I got a link for that for you. When you're prototyping, it doesn't really matter. Just throw the big image in there and play with it. But if you've heard any performance talks today, you also don't want to support, a giant image on a mobile device. And with most of these responsive frameworks, they're just taking images and scaling them down. So if you're not serving a large, medium, and small image, you're going to serve a very large weight of images in your page for a mobile device. You don't really need to. You also want to make sure you have all the basic stuff like typography, forms, and buttons, and you want to have those working across all the different devices with your basic framework, right? If you're in there prototyping, you don't have to be reinventing, how do my buttons look on mobile? How do my forms look on mobile? Just build them and code them out once for those devices, and then go back, and you can just use them when you do your prototyping. So for example, for buttons, we just use presentational classes. We have like a small blue button. Using those three classes, you get a small blue button. You can add some radius with a large blue radius button and make it large. Or we can also have a large, nice blue radius button that puts a little bit of shine on it. So it's a little pretty button that you want to click. And the framework you're using also needs to provide a foundation for your final product, right? The whole point of prototyping in code is that we can later take that code and build our final product on top of it. If you just take the whole prototype and throw it in the garbage, you waste a lot of time. This is why a lot of prototyping wireframing tools are great for doing the layout on the page, but for actually prototyping the click flow, what you're doing, you may as well just use code that's going to be strong enough to do what you're doing in your production. So again, the framework that I was showing you, the styles are very bare bones, very minimalist. So it's really easy for you just to add your actual styles on top of that. The example I showed you for Rebecca Children's Services, we took that code and we built that, finally designed code on top of the original prototype, and it worked great. All right, so let's speed through another prototype. We're going to do a quick book swapping service. This way, nobody put this thing on Kickstarter because nobody reads physical books now anyway, right? So again, first thing we start with is sketches. We'll have a home page for our book swapping service. It'll have our genres on the left, features, the top swaps. So again, the idea is you log in here, you find the book that you want, and then you swap one of your own books for that book. Fictitious service. We've got a book page. We can view the book that we want to swap for. It's going to show us the 6 books that we have to swap for that book, reviews of the content of the page. And then we're going to have a modal that pops up when we're ready to do our swap. So we can then select the book. And when you're doing prototyping, again, all these kind of common UI elements, you want to make sure they're just dead simple. So for modals, you want them to just be really easy to implement. I'll give you an example of that in a second. And then we have a confirmation page since we're trading this book for that book. So it's a pretty simple prototype. So the sketches look pretty good, but again, the reason that we do the responsive prototyping, when we do the prototyping, is that sketches just kind of show a linear flow of what's going to happen. They show the layout for each page, which is great, like wireframes, but you really can't get a feel for how everything's going to interact. Being able to click through all different pages gives you a very different sense for how the navigation works, how the content of the page explains what's going on, than just looking at the sketches sequentially. So we like to do sketches first, but definitely going to the prototype gives you a much better sense of how the app is going to work. And let's test it on mobile, of course. So again, using our grid is really easy to chop this page up. We've got our row on the top that has 8 columns on the left for the title. We have 4 columns for our login. We have our sidebar with 3 columns, and then our basic content on the right with the remaining 9 columns. And then we can embed a row down at the bottom that has a 3, 6, and a 3 to break it up. Yeah.
Determining the columns. I'm just a little confused about that. The 8 columns and 3 columns and things like that.
So I'm just most grids work the same.
The question?
Yes. The question was, how are we determining how the columns work, right? Like what's the width of the columns?
Yeah.
Gotcha. So we're using, for these examples, I'm using Foudation, which is our CSS framework, but most grids work the exact same way. It's a pretty standard pattern where we have 12 columns in the entire grid, and then in your rows for the markup, you specify how many columns are for each element. I'll show you the code in the next screen, maybe make a little more sense. So in addition to having our columns we can chop up, again, you want to have some of these common UI elements. So here we have tabs. When you click on each one of these tabs, it's going to swap out the content within there. And the markup looks something like this. So we have our DL, it says nice contain tabs. That's what creates those 3 links on the top that you click on to swap the content. And then down below it, we have the actual content for each one of those tabs. So when we're prototyping, we like to use unobtrusive JavaScript techniques to let us quickly add functionality to pages we've already written without having to write any JavaScript. So I'm sure you've seen stuff like this in jQuery plugins, but the idea is that we have the JavaScript on the page, it's listening for these click events using the live event handlers. So we have a pattern established here. When there's a link that has an anchor tag, and then you have a UL that has the nice contain tabs, then you have a UL after it. It's going to, when you click on one of those links, it's going to activate the associated tab. And it's activated using the convention on the ID. So in that UL, you can see that the LI has a class active and the ID is top tab, which corresponds to that first link that has an href with an anchor to top. So when you click on that anchor, it's going to activate the corresponding tab in the UL down below. The idea is establishing a lot of these patterns that we can just quickly prototype with using these common UI elements that we have. Again, these are all built into Foudation. So using the ID attribute to identify this tab to go with the link on top is fine. We actually started to prefer using this style instead, using the data dash attributes. The convention being IDs and classes are used for when you want to do presentational pieces. So use an ID to target a style from your style sheet. Use data dash attributes when you're trying to specify something for JavaScript. So anything that JavaScript hooks into JavaScript, using the data dash attributes makes it really clear. Anyone who's looking at this markup can see, okay, this is some kind of hook for JavaScript to activate this tab. This is a hook for JavaScript to activate this link. This isn't a style that's being targeted. So we talked about buttons, we talked a little about modals. So here on our book page, when we're going to click on this link to activate the modal, we want that modal to just pop up. We got a nice blue, really clickable button. And when we click on that, we want the modal to just show up and not have to write any JavaScript to work on that. So we have a pattern where we just have, the modal is just this div tag, and we give it the class reveal modal, so that gives it the styles for our standard modal, right? I'm sure every time you guys do a project, you rewrite how modals work, maybe use JavaScript, the jQuery modals. We have status pattern here where we then specify an ID for our modal. So the modal is just positioned on the page using these styles. It just shows up when you put this markup in. And then you activate the modal using a link. And here we're using the data dash tags again. So we have data reveal ID. So again, our JavaScript hooks into this when it sees this data dash tag. And you click on this link, it's going to fire the modal with that ID. It's just going to open it. So this lets us be able to add modals to the page really quickly without having to worry about writing JavaScript. We can just kind of make this stuff really, really fast. Here we're laying out this page. We want to push over these columns by 2. You get that white space on the left. So we can just add in effectively 2 invisible columns by adding offset by 2. So again, going through this markup, the clash row is just going to make the row that goes across the entire page. And then 7 columns is going to say, okay, I want 7 columns of the 12 to be shown on here, and then push it over by 2. So you can see those 2 images in the middle, that's 7 columns wide, pushed over by 2. So we kind of burned through the desktop pieces of the prototyping. I want to talk a little bit about how we now do this for the mobile devices. So this is what our grid looks like on a desktop device, right? But of course, this doesn't work that great on mobile because it's going to squish everything down. And if you have a very complicated grid, like we've shown in other examples where we have columns in a row, nested in other columns in another row, it's going to be too hard to read. It doesn't make any sense. So by default, this grid that I'm showing here just goes ahead and it stacks the columns like that, linearly. Takes them, puts them right on top. Pretty common pattern for how responsive grids are built these days. And we do that to our design. When we open this up on the phone, this is what it looks like. Our button's responsive, so when it sees this on a phone, it goes full width like that, and then we get our navigation on top, and it's all linear top to bottom. Which is just a little bit too much navigation, right? If you open this page on your phone, you don't see what you want. You just get a giant nav. What we really want is to see the content on top, and then maybe the navigation goes somewhere else. But again, the way we laid the page out, our sidebars on the top, our lists on the right, it should like get stacked like that. So we're going to use a technique called source ordering to flip it around so that it gets laid out the way that we want to. What source ordering does is it lets us change the order of the elements in our source code, and then use CSS to position them correctly. So the convention we're using here is we're using classes called push and pull. So when I say push 3, I'm taking my left column of 9, and I'm pushing it over by 3 columns. I'm taking my other 9 columns, my other 3 columns, and I'm pulling them over by 9. So literally, we're taking the 2 columns and we're swapping them on the presentation, but we're putting them in a different order inside the source code. So this serves 2 purposes. For mobile, it lets us put things in the order that we want, so that it's linear. When we look at it, we see the content first and then the sidebar. It's also really good for accessibility. If you're using a screen reader, the way a screen reader works is it reads every line of the content. This way, it's going to read our actual content people are interested in first, and then it's going to read the navigation at the bottom, right? You can imagine me, somebody who's blind is sitting there and having to get the navigation on every single page as you're trying to navigate through the web. And the CSS is pretty straightforward, like I said. It's literally just taking these columns, they're already position relative, and it's just moving them over. Or pushing them over in the other direction. And when we go to view the source code, when we go to view the rendered page, it looks exactly the same. Even though that content on the right, the feature content, is now coming first in the source code. And then on our phone, this is the result that we get. So this is pretty close. But navigation is still a thing that people are pretty accustomed to having, so we want to add something back in. So again, I was talking about having navigation is conditional for the 3 different classes of devices, right? Desktops, phones, and tablets. So on phones, we're going to conditionally add a select list that lets us do our navigation. It's a much more simple way to do navigation than having something like a big UI element. We're just going to add a select list, and when you hit it, we're going to take you to the page you want to go to. And we're only going to show it on phones. And we use these classes called show on phones, hide on desktop, show on tablets. These use media queries to identify which class of device that you're on, and then it applies display block or display none to the elements that they don't show. So here there's going to be a little bit of duplication, right? We're going to have our navigation there twice, but again, our content is not duplicated. It's just some of the small pieces, and You just have to do this, right? Responsive role isn't perfect. Some content is just applicable for phones, some is just applicable for desktops. And it ends up looking like this. So you may have noticed that those two featured pieces aren't actually they're not being in linear order, right? There's still two up next to each other. So there's a lot of cases on a mobile phone, we don't actually want everything to be stacked, right? That's more just a general approach that works for most things, but in a lot of cases we want that fine-grained control to say, no, don't stack this stuff, just put it side by side. So we have a concept of a mobile grid, and these are additional classes you can apply on top of your regular grid, right? Yo dog, I heard you like grids, so I put a grid on your grid. Nothing? All right. So it's a mobile grid. This grid's only 4 columns. So anything more than that, just kind of crazy sauce on mobile phones. And it lets you break things up in a mobile grid on mobile devices. And the source code looks just like this. So also you may have noticed we only have 2 of the 3 feature books. The 3rd book we just have hide on phones, so it's just blown away. 3 is too many for the phone, just show me 2 side by side. So we have our desktop columns, which is 4 columns, right? And we had 3 of these featured books, so 3 of those, 4 times 3 is 12, that adds up. And then we have our phone grid for these first 2. So phone 2 and phone 2. It means on the phone, this is going to take up 2 columns on my 4-column phone grid. And we can stack them next to each other. So you can make decisions for all of the different nested columns, nested rows that you have. Do you still want them to be in their grid in the phone, or do you want to just let them all get stacked? And again, we're accomplishing that via the hide on phones. We're hiding that 3rd one. And it looks like this. I think we're in pretty reasonable shape there. There's another sad robot. All right, so we'll wrap it up. So designing a different interface for every device is impossible, right? There's too many screens. This whole idea of like, these are the 10 different screen sizes you need to worry about, it's all crazy. 3 classes of devices, really there's only 2. There's phones and there's desktops. Tablets are pretty much big enough, you can get away with it for most pages. Responsive is going to make your life a lot easier, right? If you're using this approach, you're going to be able to reuse a lot of your code across the different devices. Not have to worry about thinking about it so much. But again, you need to think about how's this going on a phone, how am I going to fix it? Floss every day. And prototype. Iterate, right? Baby steps is the answer. And don't build the Death Star. Lastly, have passion. This guy has like the Nintendo Power Glove on his hand, and he's got these keyboards, and he's singing Michael Jackson Bad, and he's pretty good if you're taking video. This guy's got passion. He's really fired up about whatever it is he's fired up about. So if he can get that excited and show up and sing to random people in the burning hot sun, you guys can get fired up about building some really good products, right? Because great products make people happy, and that's what it's all about, making people happy. All right. That's all, what happened here? That's all I got. Just one more quick note. All the examples I showed were on Foudation. So Foudation is an open source library that we wrote so that we contribute to. It's MIT licensed, there's no like upsell, totally open source stuff. Just check it out. It's got the responsive grid and all that I showed you today. It's at foundationazure.com. Any questions?